All right, well, I'm going to talk about, the title of the paper is Gramscian Reflections on the Crisis of Democracy. I mean by the crisis of democracy, and I'll make this more precise at the very end of my comments, I mean the crisis that stares us in the face. As was mentioned, I guess 2 talks ago, after 2008, you made the point, capitalism should have collapsed. Instead, it rebounded with a vengeance and triumphed, and actually neoliberal politics took precedence over alternatives, and we seem not to be able to get rid of it. Now, even worse, monsters have appeared, such as Trump, or in my original home province, Ontario, Ford. You'll see how much of a monster we have in Quebec now with the SAQ being elected, and then in Europe. So these monsters are there, and they seem to be able to survive within kind of a thin democratic milieu, where even the weapons of the most primitive, the Schumpeterian weapons of democracy can't seem to dislodge them. So that's the crisis in generic terms that I have in mind. And the sort of Gramscian reflections are, I'm taking from 2 different categories of source. On the one hand, there's the work of Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Reclos. I was going to spend a lot of my time, maybe most of it, on Mouffe. But then I noted that we've got other talks on Mouffe here, including one specifically about her by Rick Gruneau, which is tomorrow morning. I'm very much looking forward to this, so I'm just going to truncate that and talk much more about Reclos. That's on the one hand, and on the other hand, ideas that were sparked by Gramsci with respect to different kind of democratic crisis on the part of Enrico Berlinguer in Italy. So up on the screen you see this classic, very often quoted passage from Gramsci. It did not have a lot to say about democracy theoretically per se, but what he does have to say is largely, in the details there's a lot to say, but generally. There's this famous passage, and it's the notion of hegemony that, of course, is key to it, and it's the unpacking of what hegemony is in a democratic context that inspires Mouffe Reclos on the one hand and Berlinguer on the other. The next slide, please. Here's another famous passage of his that democracy has to do with an active unity and democratic projects, including the state, but going far beyond it into civil society. Again, this theme has been discussed fairly often here already. Contra Gentile and others, for him, one is not talking about democratic agents as persons, either individual or collective persons. That turns into some kind of totalitarianism. He's talking about something else when he talks about the intervention in democratic politics, the ones that he likes, which is not a collective person, which is inherently conservative, nor is it a utopian person. It's not a liberal utopianism. A woman years ago named Susan Golding, does anyone recognize that name? Yeah, you would know her. Wrote a book called Gramsci's Democracy, or Gramsci on Democracy. And one of the themes that she carries throughout the book, which I think is very useful, is a distinction, is Gramsci's attempt to avoid having to choose between, or his attempt to, we might say, using Hegelian language, which he would not use, supersede the distinction between Sittlichkeit and Moralität. He's looking at drawing on the past, projecting a future that negates lots of the past, but he neither is a utopian visionary nor a traditionalist. And how do you do that? So that's kind of the context within which Gramsci's views on democracy are to be taken. So now let's go to MOVE, and I'm just going to be very quick here with the next one, please. Here's a quote from MOVE in her recent book, which is really stitched together a whole bunch of interventions she's been making, mainly in the electronic world. She makes very good use of it. And it interchanges largely in Europe, but they make their way into via the UK into Canada and the United States as well. The book is called Toward a Left Populism. I found out you can get it either in Kindle or very cheaply from Amazon. It's well worth reading. So that's her idea. The left populism she has in mind is the suturing of a large number of different movements: workers, immigrants, the middle classes, LGBT communities, and so on. And the idea is to forge a collective will among these people, which would be a spur to political action, bound by a shared commitment to liberal democratic citizenship. So that's the project. And the next one, please. She also thinks that this has to be involve affects. It can't be just rationalistic. You have to tap into people's feelings and culture and so on. And it's got to be agonic. And she distinguishes between agonicism and antagonism. Antagonism means that you're treating the forces that you're opposing as enemies. So it's like warfare, the war of maneuver. Whereas to treat people agonically is just to highlight the differences, if you want, do them in a way, but not antagonistically. It's more in keeping with the war of position, at least according to her. So I'm not going to talk about MOVE. I'm going to talk more about Feu mon ami Ernesto Leclos. He's been dead now these several years. What a loss. I should say that although I'm going to have some critical things to say about MOVE and Leclos with respect to democracy, a democratic project, I learn a lot from both of them. It's just if the mark of a good theory, a good book, is that it makes you think and it makes you see current events differently than you did before, then both their writings, and especially toward a left populism, and Leclos' last book, Populist Reason, I think is most sophisticated work. They sure meet the bill. Well worth immersing oneself in. So the next slide, please. Here we have, and again, I'm going to, in the interest of time and to get to some discussion, I'll be brief. Leclos' essential thesis in Populist Reason is that populism is the core of democracy itself. That democracy is always and primarily populistic in some sense. And he gets this out of originally, but there's a lot of differences from Claude Lefort, the notion of the empty space of democracy. So democracy, as Lefort famously argued, you don't have, it's not like there's a king or a bunch of oligarchs that are the rulers. The rulers are the people as such. And the people is empty. It's what some Lefortites refer to as an empty signifier. Leclos doesn't think that it is ever entirely empty, and so it's a misnomer. And the ways that it is sort of filled, sometimes in different ways, that differentiate his approach from Lefort's. So I won't read the passage. You can read it for yourself. Assuming you've done so. The next passage. So these are the tools that he uses. The notion of equivalential relations, hegemonic represented through empty signifiers, the displacements of the internal frontiers through the production of floating signifiers, and the constitutive heterogeneity, which makes the dialectical retrievals impossible and gives a true centrality to political articulation. He believes that these three things together are enough to define populism, to tell us what populism is. I'm not sure I want to take time to explicate this. It would take some time. Many of you will be familiar already with what he has in mind. To put it really crudely, the notion of equivalential relations is the notion of a hegemonic effort to weld together the people around some political project. He means the project of a movement or political party. That's the empty signifier of the people. That's how it kind of, there's a hegemonic battle to try and fill that, and to make it so. To be a democratic activist is to follow the lead of Communist Party, or to follow the lead of, Foucault thinks it could be, doesn't have to be a working class movement, it could be an environmental movement, student movement, and so on. We saw the student rebellions earlier, the women's movement, as hegemonic forces that establish these equivalential relations. If that's all there was to it, it'd be hard enough. But it's worse because there are other forces defining agonic frontiers that also are attempting to establish equivalence amongst all of the groups, the active groups in society. And so if you are, say, aiming at a progressive, pro-liberal, democratic bonding around this project as to fill the empty signifier, you also have to combat the what do you call it, the floating signifier, which is the alternative force. Now, it's not just that this is a bad thing or makes your work impossible, because that force becomes an object of agonic contestation. And all politics, for move and for le quo, involves agonic confrontation. You define yourself, your movement, in contradistinction to a hostile other. The third part of it, the notion of the heterogeneity of all this, is really a description of the impossibility of ever fully succeeding, either in defeating all of the agonically hostile, alternative, reactionary, anti-democratic efforts, nor in the attempt to achieve hegemonic leadership over all the different forces that are trying to come together. That can't be done. It's a perpetual and ongoing battle. It's like Mouffe's work on liberal democracy. Liberal Democrats, the kind I used to have to study, try to find a way to square the circle. How can you have democracy and liberalism together? And they try and roles, and they have ingenious ways of doing this. Mouffe's view, and we'll close, and I completely agree, is that you can't do it. You can work away at it. You can identify conditions that make it easier or harder to have it both ways. But that's politics. Where are we? Yes, the emergence of the people. All right. Now I want to turn to Berlinger. So can you give me the next one? This is from a very famous set of articles, first given as speeches. The analog, Andrew was asking about Professor Baca about media. And there have been, during Gramsci's time, for sure, there were geniuses, really, at making use of media. One was Goebbels in Germany, and the other was Roosevelt and his advisors in the United States, making use of the radio in one hand and the radio and film in the other, in this case. It's true, I think, that the left still is kind of slow at picking up on use of media and effectively. The analog in Italy at this time, anyway, were these speeches, talks given, political talks given by political leaders such as Berlinguer to audiences of 100 and 200,000 people. I might digress here to point out that this didn't really prompt me to think of these things, but later on I realized that I myself have a personal connection both to Berlinguer's speech and also to Populist Reason by Leclos. The talk itself came out in 3 installments in the Communist magazine very shortly after the Chilean coup of 1973. But it started with a single talk that he gave in the forum. I can't remember which, one of my Italian friends will recognize this forum.
It's Bologna.
That's in Bologna.
I think of it as Bologna.
No.
Bologna.
Is it in Bologna? Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes, it was Bologna because that's where I saw him. I was in that audience by accident. I happened to be there at the time. And then actually he repeated it again at the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, but the substantive one was in Bologna. My connection with Populist Reason is a little different. That book was originally given as a series of lectures in a special seminar hosted by the Comparative Literature Department at the University of Toronto. And so Leclos, who at that time was teaching at the University of Buffalo in New York State, came to Toronto. And we had arranged for him a really nice residence, which was a suite where he'd do his own cooking, and big suite, very close to campus, an old, very nice building. Now, Leclos was brilliant. He really was. I was always blown away by the insights that he could come up with. But he had his limitations. He did not know how to toast or make coffee. He simply, it was far beyond his ability. Chantal had to do it all. So he moved out of the suite and into our house. And so Populist Reason was written in our living room, or at least the lectures on which it was based. So I do have a certain affection for all of this. Hang on. Yes, well, that passage, I think, pretty well speaks for itself. The core of these talks, that reflections on events in Chile that Berlinguer gave, and which I should say became very important. If you want to find one text that sort of is I don't know, the touchstone text of Eurocommunism, my guess is it would be that. It had enormous influence, these talks. And Chile had really upset all of us and all over the world. Because it was a democratically elected, everything they did, everything right. The Indian, those guys, they did, at least they looked to be doing everything right at the beginning, and then it fell apart. So these reflections have the following, how many do I have? 6 elements. First, he recognized, and mainly they all have to do with alliances. So first, the alliances are required amongst a very broad, all segments of civil society. Classes, what he called intermediate strata, geographic regions, north, south in particular, but also other ones, women, youth, professionals in science, technology, culture, art. Very, very broad tint to bring people together. Next, the next slide, please. He wants, it's not a coalition in the sense of bringing people who have each their particular interests, but there's a certain overlap, and bringing them together around the overlap. It was that. That's how it will start. But the whole point of it, if the alliance is going to be successful, is that that alliance itself then actually creates a will. It creates a new will, a collective will. It's a creation of a shared commitment to civil development, as he puts it, civil development, democratic progress, personal dignity, and expansive freedom. It's a little like the difference between Hobbes and Rousseau and the contract. The big difference being that for Hobbes, as we know, people go into the contract with a set of defined interests, and then they cooperate insofar as it's in their particular interest to do so, and what they come out with leaves those interests intact. Whereas for Rousseau, the act of contracting itself changes people's interests in a more collectivist way. Well, that sort of is the idea here. Let's see, the next slide, please. So, a lot of attention for him is paid to setting out agendas for actual concrete research. Empirical research, balance of class forces, economic factors, cultural factors, and so on. And analysis of things like class composition. Catholicism, he thinks, has to be understood in all of its complexities and differentially by region. He devotes a fair amount of time to taking the Christian Democratic Party seriously, and seriously enough that it's understood, and looking for differences, frissions, even contradictions, conflicts within it, as well as alternative politics. Fourthly, he thought that this alliance building should involve engagements of people at all levels, not just the level of the state, of the formal state, but also and especially within civil society and micro civil society. It was a call for molecular politics and also macro politics. So there was a focus of the Communist Party was pretty good, I think, around this time in Italy, and involving itself in cities and municipal politics. Elected a lot of mayors as a result. Fifthly, and related to what I just said, the alliances that he had in mind would certainly represent themselves in Parliament, but they weren't. It wasn't parliamentary exclusively. Still, he argues the defense of the Constitution is vital, and that there should be democratic efforts, not just in civil society, but in the state. And that means not just the state in terms of governing structures, but the civil service, the bureaucracy, the judiciary, the army, all those kinds of levels. Finally, it should be pointed out that for him, electoral success in the result of these alliances, that electoral success had to be massive. So 51% wasn't enough, probably not 60 or 70%. You really needed to work toward overwhelming support, and there are ways to do that. Anyway, that's Berlinger. So here we have, and both Berlinger and Wolff-Laclau make references to Gramsci. So they see Gramsci as the inspiration for these reflections on how to handle how to address the democratic crises that they perceived at their times. Different crises for Berlinger on the one hand and Wolff-Laclau on the other, crises nonetheless. So what aspects of Gramsci's views are relevant to these approaches today? So let's start, next slide please. Yes. He wasn't looking, neither of them, they both, on both sides, they're not looking at individuals. They're looking at parties and the importance of the political party. And Professor Vaca made this, this morning, made this point very forcefully and well. Political parties are the main focus. It's not individuals. Therefore, in the prison notebooks, I didn't realize how much there was until I got into it, reviewing for this talk, how much there is that has to do with political party structure. He talks about organic versus bureaucratic centralism. There's a lot of talk about discipline, about party discipline. He says that you have to understand that we're dealing here with potential rulers in society. As he puts it, there really do exist rulers and ruled. The attention to democratic centralism is central to large parts of his discussions having to do with democracy. And as I interpret it, it has to do with this. In the traditional, mainly Soviet-inspired notion of democratic centralism, you've got a party, and it makes decisions, and then the membership has to follow the decisions. The membership can have democratic input into the making of the decisions, but once they're made, it's got discipline, it's got to follow it on. Now, Gramsci does not exactly disagree with that. However, the point is that the individuals in the party and the groupings within the party are also organically related to these different members of a potential or actual alliance. And so where do their allegiances lie? Do they lie with the party, or do they lie with the it's not like it's not entryism, that is. It's not the idea that they've sneaked into the groups, into these civil societal groups in order to push the Communist Party line. It is that they are actually parts of them. And so where are the alliances? Now that's a hard, then if you're going to bring the groups in via the members of the party who are active in the groups, to bring them into an alliance, one that is led by that party, then how do you make that work? How do you, without destroying party discipline and making the party nothing but a kind of a debating forum for people from representing different groups in society? That's a problem. It's just like the liberalism and democracy problem. It doesn't admit probably a complete solution, but you can work away at it. And he talks about his interest in organic centralism as opposed to bureaucratic centralism is largely designed to identify the conditions within a political party, or it could apply to a movement as well. We have to be a party. So that's one set of issues that you find in Gramsci's writings pertinent to the task that's being addressed here, namely its concreteness. A second is that theory itself. The next slide, please. It's going to involve theory, all right, but it's going to involve embedded theory. Theory that is embedded in actual political practice and action. And this is where he comes to the notion of philosophy. We've talked about that too here before. So everyone's a philosopher. And the parties are persons who are philosophers as well, as are the social movements. So, and these things are, these things, let me make sure I'm seeing that. No, go on to the next one, please. That's that one I should have shown before. What an organic. Well, go back to it. That's organic. That's where organicity and democratic centralism are supposed to be. Well, now the next slide. So this is the famous slide about philosophy in general does not exist. Now, he doesn't literally mean that. What he means is that philosophy as an independent discipline standing outside of real life and outside of political rule. That's what does not exist. What you need is you have to look at real activities. And so real philosophy is contained in political action. Now, that means it has to be, the last slide, please. That means that when you're thinking of this now in terms of forging some sort of hegemony, that hegemony says it constitutes an advance because it supposes some kind of intellectual unity and an ethic and conformity with a conception of reality that's gone beyond common sense and has become, if only within narrow limits, a critical conception. So the notion of going beyond common sense is tied in with the side of his thinking, which, although it takes account of, and crucially takes account of pre-existing conditions, it's an anti-utopian sort of approach, nonetheless is not tied up in common sense. It's no accident that the right-wing politicians typically describe their view as common sense. Also, the critical dimension of it is there. If you think that one of the reasons that people like Trump or Ford and other right-wing leaders, one reason they can get away with it is that with their base, keep their base going, is that the base does not think critically. They don't have the practice to do it, nor do they have the inclination to do it, nor is it something that is celebrated. Fake news, right? And so critical thinking becomes fairly important. When I first read this, I thought, well, there's a job for professors of philosophy, because we teach critical thinking. I've taught critical thinking. But, it's pretty sterile. You have a bunch of rules identifying, yes, this is a case of, argumentum ad hominem. This is a case of begging the question, etc. That doesn't really work very well. It's a little better if you can embed the teaching of critical thinking within actual, other philosophical topics like the social and political philosophy. But, you see, that's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about professors of philosophy in universities. He's talking about everyone. He's talking about the people in these movements. He's talking about the political parties. They should be educating people, the people with whom they interact, in critical thinking and getting them disposed to think critically and teaching them how to do it, even if that means being critical about they themselves, i.e. the parties, the movements, the activists. So those are the two broad elements of Gramsci's thinking that I think are drawn on usefully by Berlinger and by Leclos-Mouffe. Embedded theory and the notion of concreteness. All right, how does this now, let's go back to Mouffe and Leclos. How then, which of the two ways of going at, of learning from Gramsci is going to be the most useful to combating contemporary right-wing populism? Mouffe thinks, of course, it should be left-wing populism. I think, and I'm only really going to announce these things rather than argue them at any length. I think that the element of concreteness in Gramscian thinking, which is quite central to Berlinger's approach, is lacking in Mouffe. I think one has to look at real existing populism, not populism deduced from Leclos' theories about the interaction between empty signifiers and floating signifiers, but the actual rhetoric and language and appeal that right-wing populist leaders and leading parties are able to employ. And those, to my way of thinking, those involve three elements. One is, it's agonic for sure. There are enemies, the immigrants, for example, or the elites in Ottawa or in Washington, etc. Certainly it's agonic, but it's antagonistic agonicism for sure, but it's agonic. However, it also is simplistic and homogenizing. So in the case of Toronto's populist, we've had a municipal populist leader and his brother. He then died, and then his brother became head of the province recently. These are the Ford brothers. For the younger one, the one who died, there was a basic division in society between the downtown elites and the people who lived in the suburbs. And those were seen as homogeneous groups. Homogeneous groups. There was no differentiations within them or even between them. It's just that's what existed. And the solutions they came up, his solutions, his slogans were simplistic. Stop the war on the car. That was probably his central one. And the stop the war on the car meant, and he did it when he was elected, tear down the bicycle lanes and get rid of the buses. Can you imagine? Because the buses slow down, both of them slow down cars. So that was his. Those simplistic, and Trump has 2 or 3 very simplistic things. You know, if you stop build the wall, like build a wall, problem solved, those sorts of things. I'm inclined to think that that's what needs to be addressed. So if you're going to talk about what we need is a left-wing populism, you better say what populism you mean. And if it's the populism that is simplistic and homogenizing, then, yeah, you'd have left-wing populism in the sense of real existing populism today. You'd be meeting the right-wing enemies on their own turf. But you'll lose. They're much better at homogenization and simplisticism than the left. If you don't mean that, if you mean something more sophisticated, then what is it? And the theories of Laclau, on which she draws, aren't going to let you make that deduction. With respect to Laclau, and here we come to the nature of the crisis, here's what I think is the problem. Again, in both cases, it's that I think that their theories are, as it were, at too high a level of abstraction. They're not as abstract as, say, Aristotle's metaphysics or the greater logic of Hegel, but they're certainly more abstract than Erlanger or Gramscian. What is the nature of the specific nature of the crisis in democracy? What is it really from a political point of view? As I see it, the crisis is, at least in North America, and I think from what I know about it, this is true in at least part of Europe. The crisis is not that the right-wing leaders or leading parties have been able to establish a kind of hegemony over the people as a whole. They don't care about the people as a whole, even if they sometimes use rhetoric, which all politicians do. The American people elected us to do this and that. What they have is it's niche politics. Trump's base, Ford's base. That's all they're interested in. And they don't care if everyone else disagrees with them, even if the base is a minority, and it seems to fluctuate around between 30 and 40% every place. If they can just keep that base, then by a combination of bad electoral systems and the timidity and fear of their opposition, like the Democrats are scared of the base, of the vote of the base, they can stay in power indefinitely. Now see, that doesn't fit, Laclau's theories don't work there. It's not that you have, he thinks that the interaction of the politics of the floating signifier and the empty signifier are an example of Gramsci's war of position. That's a little strained in my view, but even if it were, what we have, and again, Professor Vaca made this point, what we have here is not a war of position at all on the part of the right. We have a straightforward war of maneuver. And so the equivalences, it's not, you're not competing for the same sort of thing whatsoever. And it has to be, now that's one factor. The second factor is that is neoliberal capitalism and its triumph, combined with the weakness of social democracy. The left wing of the Democratic Party in the States, the New Democratic Party in Canada, the Parti Québécois, which used to be social democratic in Quebec, and so on. They fold in the face of capitalist threats, and so they keep moving to the right. If you put all those things together, then what you require is not an agonic relationship to that dimension of right-wing populism. It's a capitalist dimension. What you need is an antagonistic one. Woofer says, well, you know, we should always be agonic, never antagonistic. Well, if real existing right-wing populism is as I described it, then you should be antagonistic toward the capitalists, the big capitalists anyway, the neoliberal capitalists, the big bankers, the hawks, and all the rest of them. You should be antagonistic. You should see them as enemies to be obliterated, not as foes to be in kind of a perpetual debate with. Therefore, it strikes me that there are Gramscian sources for combating right-wing populism. Probably they are not to be found, not yet anyway, maybe someday they will be, in the works, in the way Leclos and Mouffe appropriate Gramsci, but more likely in the kind of nitty-gritty, hard, agonic and antagonistic alliance-building politics that Berlinger was urging on his left-wing compatriots in his speeches in Bologna.